North Carolina State Highway Patrol.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
A contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today.
Rock and roll has got to go.
And welcome back to the Hometown Holler. I'm Daniel Ayers.
And I'm Quinn Ray. Well, hey, man.
It's the most ironic time of the year.
Indeed, it is.
Of the era.
Of this political moment for sure. So, we're kicking off this episode loaded with meaning. Today is MLK Day, a moment where I think we all strive to reflect on justice, equity, and the progress or lack thereof that we've made as a society. But we have made progress.
I think so.
But it's also the day that Donald Trump is being inaugurated again. And Quinn, I don't know about you, but I'm certainly feeling a lot of things today.
Yeah, man. On one hand, we've got this day dedicated to the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who gave everything to fight for equality and justice. And then we've got
Captain Bonespurs.
Yeah, like the polar opposite. Mm-hmm. Being sworn in for office, not for the first time, but the second time. Mm-hmm. It's some sort of like cosmic irony, kind of like celebrating Earth Day and setting a fire to an oil field while doing it.
Yeah, it is. It does feel like the kind of thing where, like, if you pitched it to a writer's room in Hollywood, they wouldn't accept it. It's like, nobody would ever believe this. It's not realistic.
I mean, the MAGA and Trump's controversial racial and social justice issues just seem very.
It's weird. It's surreal.
Yeah, it's weird.
But today we're not just going to talk about what's happening. We're going to try. I think we're going to try and spark inspiration. And we're going to try and honor this day and the spirit in which it deserves to be honored.
Yeah.
And the spirit of Dr. King. So this is a time to get inspired, to organize, to act, and to lift each other up wherever and whenever we can. And in that spirit, I think we should just jump right in and introduce our special guest.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I'm really excited about this episode.
On February 1st, 1965... I was arrested in Selma, Alabama, with Dr. Martin Luther King and 250 others. Here is what happened that day and how I ended up eating Dr. King's dinner. Friends and neighbors, today we're joined by the author of those words, a special guest whose life intertwines with some of the most pivotal moments in modern American history. Chuck Fager is a Quaker writer and activist with a lifelong commitment to civil rights, peace, and social justice. Over the decades, Chuck has worn many hats, working with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the Civil Rights Movement. He was a foot soldier, I guess I could say, in King's Army of Justice, his Army of Peace, leading anti-war efforts, and authoring more than a dozen books that challenge us to think deeper about faith, patriotism, activism, and he even made an appearance on The O'Reilly Factor. Bill O'Reilly,
that's awesome.
Famous friend of the Holler.
yeah,
and live to tell the story. Only you gotta pay me extra for that one.
Yeah, that might be a back porch.
Right.
Your appearance on the O'Reilly Factor. So the government, I gotta say, Chuck, the government's got quite a file on you. According to Uncle Sam, there's like a dossier I've heard. You got the FBI has a file on you. You might be the most dangerous guest we've ever had on the Hometown Holler. So whether
you got to bump up your game then.
whether through his actions on the front lines of activism or through his writing, Chuck's work has shaped movements and inspired many to stand up for what's right. So today we're going to talk about his time in the Civil Rights Movement, which he recounts in his wonderful book, Eating Dr. King's Dinner, a Memoir of the Movement, 1963 to 1966, offering a first-person account of his experiences in Dr. King's Army of Peace. Chuck, welcome to the Hometown Holler.
Man.
Well, thank you. And you know what? Before we talk about me, I want to add to your pile of irony the fact that we have just finished paying not adequate tribute to one of Dr. King's most true and successful and dedicated kind of followers or people inspired by him, James Earl Carter, who had the cojones to get up on his inauguration day as governor of Georgia and say the time for discrimination by race has passed. And his example, I mean, I never really met him. I wanted to go down and take his Bible study class. Plains, Georgia, never got around to it. I thought he'd live forever, you know.
So I actually got to do that. So we should talk about that on the back porch
so
too.
Jealous.
Yeah, I got to go to
but
church
anyway,
with Jimmy.
I just want to say, so aside from the things you mentioned, for me anyway, his example and inspiration are over us all. So anyway.
And the flag is still at half-mast in his honor.
I sure hope so.
Yeah. Well, Chuck, let's start with
So
go all the way. Let's go back to the beginning. You came from a respectable, family that served this country in the military. You were a military Air Force kid, is that right? How did you end up a dirty hippie?
I didn't. I wasn't a hippie. When I went off the rails, I was called a beatnik.
Okay.
You're historically
a proto-hippie.
Yeah. Well, no, the hippies were a degenerated form of us beatniks.
Gotcha. Okay, they regressed.
Yes.
You were the evolved.
Well, we were over the hill by the time they came along.
So how did you become not a dirty hippie but a refined beatnik?
Well, how many hours do we have? I was in
because your dad was in the military.
Yes,
so
he
it
was.
just seems
Yes, he
like
was.
That's not the origin story for somebody who's dedicated their life to peace activism.
You know, I've written some other books trying to make sense of all of that. There was a.
He's telling us we should have read that before he asked this question.
There was a whole sequence of crazy coincidences which I couldn't put into a novel because no editor would say, "Oh, come on.
Yeah.
Oh, come on. Oh, come on." So I really, for now, we can start it at one morning at Colorado State University, where I was a student. I had going into my senior year, 1963, and
Deion Sanders wasn't coaching the football team.
Not yet, no, but
Okay.
Mike Lude, I think, did it. I was from the classic era where we lost 69 games in a row. Excuse me. Was that no? I think 27. Three seasons. 3 seasons. We got beat by the Air Force Academy by 69-0.
Wow.
They won a game in my freshman year, and they didn't win again till my senior year. So, anyway, sports wasn't a big thing. I had been in ROTC, and that summer before, I had actually quit ROTC. I was not a peacenik at the time. I had no beef with anybody in the Air Force ROTC.
Did you pick up like a Jack Carraway book, and you're just like,
well, something like that. I just realized, actually, and I had passed the pilot's physical. My father was a bomber pilot in World War II, and I had thought I'd be a pilot. Except I discovered, flying around with one of the ROTC instructors, that I found flying an airplane kind of dull, believe it or not. It was sort of like driving a bus, except just got more stuff on the control board and stuff.
and you're in the air, Chuck.
It's funny.
Yeah, right. So
The Air Force recruiting posters would have me believe that there's nothing more exciting, more to be desired than to be behind the joystick of a.
Yeah, like that's always if they ask me my superpower, it's
Yeah.
like I want to fly.
well, there was a classic quote. You're repeating my history. There was a instructor, Air Force ROTC instructor, Major Bass, and he took me up in a training jet north of Denver, and we flew down south around the Air Force Academy and all this stuff, and I was in the back seat, and I had done some flying, and Major Bass had got on the intercom, and he said to me, "Chuck, when I'm up here flying in this plane, I don't know that I can think of anything else I'd rather be doing than flying. And you know what? That hit me like a 2x4 upside the head, because I seen back and I thought, you know what? I can think of half a dozen things I'd rather be doing than this.
That ain't me.
Now, 1963, they in ROTC, if you went through it and you got a commission, you had to stay in the Air Force for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And when I told Major Bass later that I couldn't really do this anymore, as I say, I was not a peacenik. I did not object to the military at that time. Nothing. I said, it's just not my thing. Mm-hmm. And he said,
you
well,
were around it your whole life.
He said, well, I know that you're a bookish guy and you write stuff. You're writing for the campus paper.
That's a nice way to say
said,
nerd.
you know what? We didn't say nerd then.
Sure.
We can send you to graduate school, the best graduate school you can get into. Pay all your fees, and I think I can get you a gig teaching English, which that's probably what I would do in graduate school then, at the Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs. Is that a good deal? And she said, yeah, but you'll have to stay in the Air Force a year longer for each year we send you to grad school. It's a reasonable deal. And he said, here's the magic words. You only pay for it in years of your life. Then that 2x4 came and whacked me upside the head again. I said to myself, but it was like a booming voice, that's all I've got. And I don't want to spend more years. I don't want to spend any years doing this.
But you did.
So
end
I didn't.
You did end up in school, in Cambridge.
Yes, but that's later. That's another lifetime.
Okay. So to jump ahead a little bit, and to jump maybe.
I'm sorry. We get this. Yes.
No. So obviously a career. You were never going to make top brass in the military. That was not in the cards for you.
I would have been in trouble. Who knew? I didn't. That Vietnam was right around the corner. I mean, the Air Force was boring.
Right.
I grew up in an Air Force environment between the end of World War II and the coming of Vietnam. Well, you know what? Again, a military without a big war to fight. I think this Major Bass, he was trained to be a pilot in World War II, and they sent him to the Far East. He came on late. When he got there, the Japanese had surrendered.
Right.
And he spent 20 years as a bomber pilot, and he never dropped a bomb.
Just hanging around.
Yeah. And
that's a gig.
Anyway, I wasn't going to do that. What was I going to do? I didn't know.
So you dodged a bullet and put yourself in front of bullets.
So that was actually the connection I was going to make, because you do end up, and you make this analogy in your book, you do end up in a form of military service.
Yes.
And I think it's a very strong analogy. The civil rights movement, Dr. King's movement, was in many ways, it was organized like an army. Logistically, there's a chain of command. You, as a rank and file member, were trained. There was a training. You took orders. That came down the chain of command. Now your weapons were nonviolence.
Right.
And so your means were maybe different, but the apparatus was very similar to the military.
At least I felt like it that way. I don't know if anybody else would describe it. Yeah, Dr. King was a general. I was a private, and there were real risks.
Yeah.
We weren't shooting at anybody, but there were people who were threatening and shooting. Could have been shooting at us.
Specifically, your job, and I don't know if this was your first job when you joined the movement, but one of the roles that one of the hats you wore was as the guy who was maybe going to have to take a bullet.
There were 3 or 4 of us, and on several occasions they asked us or instructed us to walk around Dr. King when he went at the head of a march downtown. And I asked him why we're doing that, and he said, because Selma's tallest building then was 3 stories, but there were 2 or 3 of them, and He said, in case somebody's up on the roof, you're going to block their aim. So what happens if they squeeze the trigger and, they get me instead of him? And Big James Orange was sort of a sergeant who was instructing me, and he slapped me on the back, and he said, don't worry about it, Chuck. I promise, if you get shot, Dr. King will preach at your funeral.
So you said this was in Selma, and
Yes.
when you think of Selma and the civil rights movement, I think people really think about the big march across the bridge and like the movie, right? But this wasn't the case in your book when you talk about having dinner, or were you in Selma multiple times with King?
I was there for a year. I moved there, and Dr. King came and went. He was always getting asked to make a speech here, make a speech there, and that's sort of how he raised a lot of the money for the movement. But I didn't follow him around except when he was in town, and they told me to march around him. On one occasion, by the way, I learned later that cops and the FBI thought there really was somebody in the vicinity with a rifle trying to get shot. So maybe I earned my grand salary of $25 a week on that occasion. So, but anyway, the time we got arrested at the beginning, when you mentioned that quote from my book, that was on the 1st of February. It was a march that I don't think Dr. King was even on that day, because I was just in the march rather than walking around him. No, Dr. King, of course he was in the march. That's the story.
So when you were told that you were going to be this bodyguard, per se, human shield, putting your life on the line,
right?
How did you make sense of that responsibility, and how did that understanding help shape your way you've moved in this movement?
Well, that's where my military exposure just clicked right into place, because in the military you don't follow your bliss, you follow your orders.
Sure, but were you thinking the whole time like, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit?
Well, yes, but I also know. I mean, my father didn't talk about his experience. He was. It was not a miracle, but the total fortunes of war that he survived 25 bombing missions over Europe. Wow. A whole lot of his buddies did not. So it was a real thing, and so I was close enough to know that it was a real thing.
Right.
And
you were under no illusions.
But we thought of the military then, and many people think about it now that are associated with it. You go out and you are serving your country. You're doing something for the common good, and something that could be hazardous and dangerous, and you put yourself in harm's way if need be. And that's and I felt that way about Dr. King and the movement. The movement was doing something good for the country, for the world.
And what was this march in Selma for? Can you just let the listeners know what
Well,
this
one happened in February 1st. We were marching downtown to an office where supposedly voter registration took place. It did take place there for white people, but black people mostly got to stand in line and get turned away, and sometimes they got arrested and harassed and otherwise troubled for showing up. And so we had several marches. They only registered people on alternate Mondays, February 1st, 1965. Well, that's 60 years from about 10 days from now, 60 years ago. And
really?
It was a Monday, so an alternate Monday. So you'd have to go in and wait in line, and they'd give you baloney about why you couldn't register.
And before this march, y'all met at a church, Brown's Chapel.
Brown Chapel,
Brown's
AME.
Chapel. And you're getting ready. You're praising and singing and hearing gospel songs.
Right.
How many white people were there?
Not many. I don't know. I believe I may have been the only white person arrested that day. There were several hundred people arrested, but mostly they were local folks, local black people.
What made you do this, right? What made you decide to take your privilege of being a white male, in the civil rights age, the heyday of it, and I don't want to say compromise it, but risk it, right? Because you could have done nothing, Chuck, and you would have been fine.
Yes. Well, here it is. Remember, I quit ROTC and the chance to be a pilot because in 1963, me, Chuck Fager, I found that boring, lifeless. When I walked into my very first Civil Rights Movement mass meeting, which was earlier in Atlanta, and I heard the singing, and I felt the ambiance. This was real. This was happening. This was where I wanted to be.
And it wasn't
And
for the
I was
rush
willing-
of excitement. It was you believed in it.
Well, it was exciting, but yes, it was. This was where I felt like I was had a chance to be a part of something that was really going to make a significant difference. And I was a foot soldier in a much larger kind of thing. And certainly all the people in it were human and fallible and so on and so forth.
Did your family think you'd lost your damn mind when you not just expressed interest in joining, but then joined and moved to Selma, Alabama?
I'm told that my mother read that I'd been arrested in a paper from Denver once, and they were not pleased. Mm-hmm. But
were your parents racist?
Not
Damn,
in,
Quinn.
No, I mean,
it's a legitimate question.
Sure.
Well, the total answer is yes, but no.
Okay.
Because I never heard him talk about that. The Air Force was officially desegregated in 1955 at an Air Force high school. We had one black student. We tried to turn him into Jackie Robinson, and he kind of went along with it. But that was something. Mm-hmm. And my parents, as far as I know, were apolitical, and they did not use the N-word. They did not teach me that black people were inferior. They didn't talk about politics. They were not liberal. I didn't fit the profile for white people in the movement. Colorado State was it was a respectable school, but not an elite school. Mm-hmm. It wasn't in the East, and my parents were not liberals, particularly. Right. I never remember talking politics with them, but we did. I mean, and yet, when I was confronted with this, I had a reflexive reaction like, this, we didn't even call it racism then, call it segregation. Mm-hmm. It's not right. It's not American. I'm an American. I've been raised to serve America, and this is a way to do it. And if I get a chance to do it, by God, I'm going to do it.
That to me, I mean, that's patriotism, right?
Right.
And
that's what I thought of it that way.
And I find it really interesting. Your parents seem like the exact demographic, the exact type of folks that Dr. King was trying to reach through the movement. Folks who were maybe I would have identified as proud American citizens, but relatively apolitical, didn't get involved in the messiness of politics, maybe had, we would say, button-down conservative values, but had a strong sense of dignity and indignation at seeing the violation of others' dignity. I'm thinking your parents are probably the folks who would have turned on the TV and seen the dogs and the fire hoses and had the reaction that Dr. King was trying to achieve to move the middle.
Well, that's a reasonable guess. I never had those kinds of conversations with my parents, so I wonder about it myself. On the other hand, well, there was an incident. We were transferred. We were on a base between San Francisco and Sacramento for a while in the 50s, and then we were transferred to a base at the western end of Puerto Rico, and we had to get in a car. By the way, I'm the oldest of 11, so we were in a crowded Lincoln. There weren't 11 of us then, but anyway, several. and we headed for Mobile, Alabama, to get on a plane. And we stopped somewhere, I think, in Texas. And we all had to jump out and go to the bathroom. There was this restroom, a gas station there, and out in the middle of nowhere, as far as I could tell. And I went around the corner to get in the restroom, and I came to the door, and it said, "White." And I thought, what? Again, 2x4 up the side of the head. And I looked around and walked back a little further, and there was a smaller door, skinnier, ramshackle, said colored for men. And I had not had any conversations about stuff like this, but I had an immediate reaction. I went into the colored one, and I was outraged. How did that come about? I can't tell you, but I can tell you that really happened. Went back, got in the car, we drove on. Now,
no questions. Never like, Mom, Dad, what is this?
If there were, I don't remember them.
Sure.
And so,
how old are you, Chuck?
82.
82, and the oldest of 11.
That's right.
So you're in Selma.
I'm in Selma.
You're doing the march. You're helping. You're not haven't took up the Quaker faith. Is that what
right? I'd quit being a Catholic. If you'd asked me, I would have said I'm more or less an atheist.
Reading some, beatnik poetry, listening to the Grateful Dead.
No, the Grateful who? Kingston Trio, please.
Okay.
Peter, Paul, and
Where have all the flowers gone?
Long time.
That's right.
This morning on February 1st, the Monday, meet at Brown's Chapel. Get the marching orders. Make sure nobody retaliates. And y'all can potentially meet up with two different leaders of the opposing side, right? You could meet up with the public safety director, Wilson Baker, and then you could also have met up with Jim Clark, who was like
the Bull Connor.
Yeah, the yin and the yang.
Like the Alamance County Sheriff.
Ooh, there we go. Say it louder for the folks in the back.
Like the Alamance County Sheriff.
Y'all get there. You start marching. It's inevitable. We're getting arrested. That was the goal of the day, to get arrested.
That's right.
Yeah. You didn't go in. You went in expecting that outcome.
Yes, and they knew we were going to do it.
Yeah.
And
meaning the authorities.
Right.
So it's really this game of you're going in knowing I'm going to be arrested. They know that your goal is to get arrested. So, Jim Clark, Wilson Baker, is their goal just to make this as to deny you an opportunity to get good press? Is that kind of the name of the game?
Yeah, they had Wilson Baker and Jim Clark were rivals and
kind of like Super Troopers,
personal and political.
The movie Super Troopers.
Well, Baker was in a suit.
Okay.
And
Jim
nice
Clark
hat.
was in a uniform. The TV commercial. He didn't have a helmet.
Okay.
He had a build cap. And he was old school in those days. He wanted to beat us up.
I was going to say he probably had a club. That's what old school means.
Yep. Wilson Baker was in a suit. He was new school. Dr. King had a campaign a couple of years earlier in Albany, Georgia, which had failed. And it had failed largely because the police chief there, Laurie Pritchett, had studied them and figured out something. He arrested them, but he arrested them very quietly, very professionally, took them inside the jail,
the press
shut the
hated
door.
That shit, didn't they?
Well, after a couple of days, the press goes home. And he knew that, and he just kept doing it that way, and the press went home and didn't come back, and the movement largely failed. So that's what he came to Selma to do. He was hired by a new mayor in Selma to help get to like a northern factory to come move into town, and that meant not necessarily integrating. It meant not giving the Yankee press anything to really take pictures of. If Dr. King wanted to come, that was unfortunate, but you treated him with kid gloves, so he'd have his march and go away. But Jim Clark, they had rivalry over jurisdiction because he was the county sheriff And Baker said, well, this is the city of Selma, and I'm
It's
the
kind
boss
of crazy
here.
because
is.
the building shared
That's
the
right.
jails of each.
Don't ask me to explain that. I mean,
It's a weird bureaucracy.
yes. They have their own jail now, the separate county jail now, but I have not been a guest there myself. But
I want to jump ahead a little bit to, you go on this march and you do get arrested as you
Right.
expect, and you are being processed with, dozens, hundreds. I mean, there's a lot of you who got arrested.
probably about 300 would be my recollection.
And you're in this I guess you're at the jail. You're at the jailhouse.
Yes, we are.
And you get, for whatever reason, they pull you out of the gaggle.
Right.
And they send you down into, I guess, the bowels of the jailhouse. I guess to this day you don't know why they picked you. You were just a guy. I mean, you were the only white guy. I don't know if that had anything to do with it. But you end up in a jail cell with Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy.
That's right. Now, we were all in this same room, and the sheriff. We had been arrested by Wilson Baker, but we were in the county jail. One reason was because I learned the city jail was tiny compared to. It couldn't hold 300 people.
Well, that's kind of here
So-
like Alamance. You'll get arrested in Burlington and go down to Graham.
And so we were all together upstairs, and we had my first Quaker. Dr. King said, "I have a cold. I don't want to preach today. Let's have a Quaker type meeting." I didn't know.
So people
I
were
didn't know what
expecting
that
him
was.
to preach.
Right.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I would too, right? Like, I just
Yeah.
marched with King. We just got arrested. Now we're all in jail together. And, I'm sitting there. He's probably one of the last ones to get processed. He comes through that door. I'm expecting him to say something profound to me, to say
Right.
something to keep our spirits alive while we're here
Right.
in this jail together, because, like, he's our dude.
Right.
Was this the first time you had interacted with him? I mean, I know you've been around him. Oh, you're fine.
Not really the first time, but it was more intense in a little while.
Gotcha.
So there we are, and he said, "I got a cold. I don't want to preach. Let's have a Quaker type meeting." Well, if you've been to a Quaker type meeting around here, especially my type, they tend to be pretty quiet. Well, this one was full of local black folks, including several who were part-time preachers. And also, all of us, I mean, me at the bottom learning, were used to singing a cappella in a very lively way. So this was like no other Quaker-type meeting
This was
I
a
think I
hybrid.
have ever been in
Yeah.
since then, because we rocked that place. We rocked it. Several, I don't know, dozens of us were standing along the steel wall to separate us from the women, pounding on the wall in rhythm.
Wow.
Plus, we're singing, "I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Gonna do what the spirits say do." And I mean, it is something that was part of what pulled me into the movement. There was, well, they got a word. They got a word for it. Soul. Okay, they got a word for it, and there was meaning to that word, which I can't explain, but I've experienced. And so this went on for 2 hours.
Wow.
We steamed. There were little tiny windows way up around the corner, along the edge of the room, and we steamed them all up. And finally, we sort of quieted down. And then the sheriff came clanging the gates open in one corner, and he looked in and he started pointing. And he pointed to Dr. King first. "King, over here. Abernathy, over here." And then there was another fellow who was a part of the movement whose name I can't remember, "Over here." And then he pointed at me. "Over here." Why? Well, because I was white, and I was a paid professional outsider,
Right.
Outside agitator, $25 a week. I mean, making my fortune. And probably that's why. Now, tactically speaking, why would he do that? Well, you decapitate the movement, your adversary's leadership. You don't necessarily shoot them all, depending on your extremism, but he took us downstairs to what was the city jail, which was tiny, just really 2 rows of cells. And he put us in, and I didn't see anybody else in any of the cells. And then he put the 4 of us in one cell. They had 2 bunk beds. I got pictures of it, believe it or not. I visited it later, and there we were the rest of that day and that night. And Dr. King stayed in jail for 3 or 4 days. They pulled me out the next day.
With a cold.
And I got to see him there. It was an intimate encounter. I got to see him do things that not very many people got to see him do. I got to see him, wait for it, take a nap. And he knew how to do that. Lay down on this steel bed with a mattress about 1.5 inches thick, and bam.
So no small talk. He wasn't like, "Thank you."
A little
cool.
bit, but you know what? He was tired. Yeah. You can hardly imagine how exhausted he was, even then.
What about with like Ralph? Was he? There was just no small. And in your book, you talk about how they kind of like small talked with each other, but did they just ignore you? Like,
no, I talked some, but I had learned in the military. See, class and status in the military are externally marked. You know, you got stripes on your arm, you got bars on your collar, and I had learned as a teenager, I had learned to be able to look at, you're probably a captain, and you're a first lieutenant, and that one over there is either a major or lieutenant colonel. I mean, I could pick, I had...
Judging books by covers here, Chuck.
That's what you're supposed to do.
Right.
But along with that went patterns of social interaction. You weren't really supposed to
Speak out of turn.
and officers were not supposed to become familiar with enlisted people, because they're the ones you're going to send up the hill to get shot down. I mean, you may get shot down too, but I mean, you're given the orders to do that, and they are the ones that are carrying them out. So I was not that uncomfortable with my modest place there, but I did get to talk with him some. As a matter of fact, I say, I think in the book, that there was a moment when I missed what I think is a footnote in history, because I don't know, I asked him, Dr. King, what's it going to look like if we really do, reshape America the way, I mean beyond getting black people able to vote and stuff. And he said, well, we're not going to get it. We're not going to get where we need to go unless we have some serious economic kind of changes. And I said, really? Well, what do you mean? He said, well, I think we need, quoting from memory, not exactly, but the key phrase is from memory. I think what we really need in America, we need a modified form of socialism. At that moment, I sat there feeling like being addressed almost as an equal, and I nodded sagely like I understood perfectly what he meant. And then once I got out of jail and began to think about it, I kicked myself, and I do ever since then, because I didn't ask the next question. Dr. King, what do you mean by modified? Because even then, conservatives were saying the post office is socialism.
Right.
Public health is
Social
socialism.
Security, socialism.
Social Security is social. I mean, and that means communism, and that's horrible. What are you talking about? And keep in mind, I was innocent of all this sort of stuff. Not very well.
How old were you at this time?
22.
22 at the time. So you're in the jail cell with them.
Yep.
I want to ask a question real quick, just because one of the things that strikes me in the book is the experience with Dr. King. You're reading this story knowing that you as the protagonist are going to have this encounter with one of the easily top 5 greatest Americans that this country's ever seen. Some would say maybe the greatest. I would put Frederick Douglass up there with him, but it's we could have that conversation.
Right.
But you're going to have this intimate encounter, and this is a person who is in the pantheon, and what sage wisdom is he going to sprinkle on you? What is this encounter with fate going? What doors is it going to open up? And then he gets in the jail cell and takes a nap. And a couple things stuck out to me. One, it was very demystifying, and it was very humanizing to see that Dr. King was a man who had his limits and needed his siesta, needed his nap. He was exhausted. That was one. And the other thing that stuck out to me was that he was very intentional. And what I mean by that is when he was in jail, that was one of the few times when he could be contemplative, when he could meditate, because he and I think Abernathy both fasted. They went on a fast.
You're blowing my narrative here.
Well, I'm not okay. Maybe I'll back off and let you take it over. But that struck me that it was. Some people would maybe describe it as anticlimactic. I don't see it that way. I saw it as humanizing and demystifying, and in that way, inspiring. I mean, I take naps. So then, okay, I don't want to blow your narrative. So maybe we can pick up with the fasting and
As far as demystifying, the very first time I actually met him, it was in his offices in Atlanta. I had just started. I sold myself to his office manager as being a writer, which I was going to be. I had sort of started on the campus, but I wasn't really doing very well at that goal in their office. But anyway, Dr. King, this was December of 1964, and Dr. King came into the office, and he was getting ready to leave for Oslo to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Pretty, big moment. And he comes around saying goodbye, and this little hallway that was not a big fancy set of offices. And he comes down the hall, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, this is our new subsistence worker, Chuck Fager." And he said,
our new serf.
Yes. Yeah. He said,
churl.
"Well, how do you do?" And he puts out his hand, and I shake his hand, and my first thought was, he's shorter than me. Not real short.
Yeah.
I was a couple inches taller than I am now, almost 6 feet. He was shorter than me. That was jarring. I mean, he should have been 7 feet tall at least, So people get demystified, I guess, in sort of ways. But yes, Dr. King, he was exhausted. Keep in mind, besides this punishing travel schedule, and the Lord knows how many committee meetings, he gets death threats every day.
Yeah, credible death threats.
Credible death threats. I saw a few things that came in the mail
and
to him, and that's a stressor, okay?
Sure. Psychological.
Well, and when I was reading this part in your book, not trying to blow your narrative here, Chuck, but we're coming short on time here. When I read the part about them, not eating and fasting and the taking Gandhi's type approach, I mean, I can see that, but I was like, nah, bullshit. It's because he didn't want to get poisoned. He didn't want to, he's in prison, and he didn't want to eat food because he is MLK.
Yeah.
He has nowhere to go. But I mean
and he's in the belly of the beast, and there's no no, you're right.
Yeah, I mean that's just what I thought. But then I mean he did learn a lot, and his teachings are you can trace them back to the teachings of Gandhi. But
it could be a both.
Yeah, it can be a both and. I mean, depending on how long.
But
he's
either
there.
way, he wasn't eating.
Right. Let me jump forward.
Yeah.
He was napping. I was just sitting there and I was getting hungry because I hadn't really had anything to eat all day.
How many hours had you been in the cell at this point?
Well, 3 or 4, but keep in mind I got up real early and I knew I was going to jail, and I couldn't eat anything. I was too keyed up, so I didn't have any breakfast. And I get there, so I'm getting very hungry. And then I hear this guy coming down the aisle saying, "Dr. King, I got dinner for Dr. King." And I peek through the bars, and there's a guy in a sort of a kitchen, jacket, and he's pushing a little cart.
Was he an inmate as well, working?
Yeah, a trustee.
Okay.
They let him work in the kitchen, and there was one plate on this little kitchen cart, and it was piled high with collard greens. And I have to point out that I'm not a Southerner, and my earlier encounters with collard greens had not gone well. I didn't like the way they smelled. I didn't like the way they looked. I didn't like the way they taste. But I underwent an instantaneous conversion looking at those. They looked wonderful. They smelled, delicious. Anyway, the guy came down, and Dr. King woke up, and he came to the gates, to the bars of our cell, and he starts talking to the trustee, and I am riveted on the plate. Okay, if you've ever fasted for a day, you'll understand. And I'm looking at them and I'm smelling them and I'm just thinking how wonderful they are. But I'm also thinking in my military head, he's a general, I'm a private. Armies need to move on good generalship. People got to be able to think clearly to make general decisions.
And that requires collard greens.
And right, sometimes. And me, I'm a grunt, and grunts, they get what's left and they do without because war is hell.
Happens.
So anyway, so if this is the worst that happens to me, and then Dr. King is saying, so I'm sorry I can't eat your greens, and I had not been paying attention, and what? and the trustee says, what?
And this trustee, was he black as well?
He was black as well, yes. And you could tell, well, anyway, Dr. King then starts again and tells him all about Gandhi and how Gandhi set up this a regimen of self-discipline and stuff when he went to jail in India. And Dr. King had studied Gandhi, and he was impressed by that. And he and Abernathy talked about this and developed their own routine. And fasting for the first 2 days was that routine. And I'm listening to this. I had never heard of it. I might have heard of Gandhi. I never studied Gandhi. I didn't know anything about this sort of stuff.
Sure as hell ain't fasting willingly.
That's right. I said, well, really? So he said, so that's why I can't eat your greens. And the trustee still sort of, you ain't going to eat my greens? And think of it. It's sort of like, I compare him, I hope nobody's offended, to like the little drummer boy, you know?
Right.
Well, he does one thing. He cooks in the kitchen. They let him cook.
No, I would be crushed, if I'm here offering my one thing and it's being turned down for reasons that seem pretty theoretical and very abstract.
What?
Like,
Who's this guy, Gandhi?
Yeah, who's
What?
Gandhi?
And so anyway, but there it was, and he looked, and Dr. King shook his head. No, I'm not going to eat your greens. So then he looked at Abernathy. Shook his head. Then he looked at the other fellow, whose name I can't remember. Shook his head. And then he looks at me. I like to say that.
Did you shake your head?
I said my heart was moved with compassion. Like the parable of the Good Samaritan. He sees this guy on the side of the road. His heart is moved with compassion. If it wasn't my heart, it was an organ maybe a little bit lower down. And I just said, I never heard of this guy Gandhi before, and I didn't know anything about this. And I'd hate to see you go away, not empty-handed, and nobody else would do it. I'd be willing to eat your greens.
You'll take one for the team.
Yeah, and he looks at Dr. King, and I looked at Dr. King, and if Dr. King had said, "Hey, we're under discipline here. We're doing it. You follow your orders, not your bliss," but he said, "Sure." Why not?
Wow.
He hadn't asked me to do this.
Right.
So I ate every last bit.
And there was a hidden surprise in there too, wasn't there?
That's right. I got the plastic fork, so I couldn't, plastic, so I couldn't turn it into a dangerous weapon.
Can't shank anybody.
And dug in, and it went in a little ways and hit something, and I thought, wait a minute, the poison did occur to me.
Man, that would
something.
have freaked me out.
And I sort of lifted it up, and the collard greens fell away, and there was a big, thick piece of the finest Alabama country ham. And there were actually 2 such slices.
Man, one of
both of which I ate.
Reading this account when this happened, it really is. There is a stark contrast between Dr. King and the kitchen worker that really reveals such a racial dynamic at the time, because I can only imagine feeling as that trustee is like, this is somebody who's going to help my people. He is our person. I am going to take care of him the best I can. and then just being not shunned, but kind of, right? Because he could have just said no, but he gave him this like very theoretical type explanation that, you know, I'm guessing here, assuming, and I know what assuming does, but it probably went way over his head, right?
I think
very
so.
this like
Kinda went over
educated,
mine.
higher level type thinking. So it's just really interesting to see how the country was at the time and how King was. And you were there,
I was there.
and you ate Dr. King's dinner.
I did. Every bit of it.
And folks can read about it. You got a website?
Sure. afriendlyletter.com.
afriendlyletter.com. You got a bunch of books. That's just one of them. You've written pretty prolifically.
I wrote a lot about Quakers too.
But before we wrap up, I want to ask you a little bit. You know, we are commemorating the legacy of Dr. King. This day means a lot to many people, but I imagine it must mean something pretty profound to you. It's been such a central. It's been a focal point of your life: civil rights, the fight for justice and equality. Look, as you survey the landscape of 2025, I'm sure you can find areas of progress and areas where, you know, we've come a long way. But I'm also sure you find areas where not only have we not made progress, but maybe we did make progress and it's been rolled back. What is your take inventory for us real quick of kind of where things stand now in your estimation?
Well, it wasn't until later that I realized that in 1965, while I was there in Selma, it was kind of like me walking into a big action movie in the last 15 minutes, just in time for the big car chase and the climactic shootout. And it was very exciting, and the bad guys were pushed back. We made a lot of progress from that, and I was a foot soldier in that much larger encounter, and I'm grateful to Dr. King and to the brave people of Selma who put up with a whole lot of grief. But what I noticed only retrospectively was that there were people there who were old. It wasn't noticing old people then, who had been subjects of this struggle and the oppression that gave rise to it since the beginning. The exclusionary laws in Alabama came about in 1900 and in 1965. So there were people who were old, who could remember practically all of it.
Decades. I mean,
Yes.
the whole arc
generations,
of Jim Crow.
three generations. Well, the Jim Crow was older than that, but the exclusion from voting was from the beginning of the century. And I really don't know what it was like for them then. But you know what? Now in 2025, one of my main thoughts is, and Dr. King, I think, knew this, we could be looking at a struggle just as long. I won't see the end of it, but you all might, or at least that going that long. I mean, in the U.S. today, we are not raised to think in terms of our lives, really, in that kind of, especially if you're in activism. Very few are thinking that kind of long term. And I think we need to do that. I think we need to do that. I don't know. There may be exciting moments like Selma coming. I hope so. But it's not going to be the same. And I have a feeling it could be more like what those elders had experienced for all you all, more than what I did. And that'll take some preparation. And preparation, I guess, starts the rubber meets the road starting today.
And in the profound words of MLK, I mean, he said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it always bends towards justice.
And
we know it's going to be long.
When I tell the story to groups that have young people in it, I say, I thought it was done. I thought I had a happy ending to my story. They took it away from me. We're back in the struggle now. And you know what, friends? It's your turn.
Well, on that note, Daniel.
Yeah. It's our turn. Listener, it is your turn. It's all our turn. I think this has been, honestly, it's hard to think of a better way to commemorate the day, the man, than with Chuck Fager. We appreciate you coming here and sharing your memories, your lessons, and we appreciate you, listener, for joining us. We hope that you see this not as a day off, but a day on. And with that, we will see you on the next episode of the Hometown Holler.